Hello, and welcome to Real Television. My name is Spencer, and today we're going to be talking about Interview with a Vampire. I just want to start it off with the fact that this video is probably going to be a little bit different moving forward, especially with other videos coming up soon. I've decided to start off with this one in the new formatting, so to speak, just because this one was one that Spirit told me to break down for y'all. And again, if you're not spiritual, that's okay. You don't have to be. You can think of this as like psychological benefit, if that makes sense. Of course, I'm not a therapist or a psychologist or anything. This is just my insight personally and what I think these symbols mean. So if you want to talk to a therapist about archetypal healing, at least that's what I call it. I'm not sure if that's an actual thing, but I would recommend that. So if you need healing through emotions or what have you, that's probably going to be your best bet. I will say that for now. So before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about where vampires came from, just before we start breaking the movie down. I took a class in college where we learned about vampires and where they came from, and how the story sort of evolved into a legend, And it was very, very fascinating. I wish I remembered where I put all of my notes, but I know some of it. I do. Some of it was, I'll just give you a basic rundown so that we don't take too much time in this section. But basically, if you've heard of Count Vlad Dracula from Wallachia, I think that's how you say it, he was actually one of the rulers of Wallachia, which I believe is today's Romania/Transylvania area. But basically, he was such a big leader, somebody who really helped the country out at that time. But who he was is kind of, debated as far as if he was like a good person or not. At least, don't quote me on that. At least that's what we learned in class. But basically, his legend of the impaling and stuff like that eventually turned into stories about vampires, and that's where Nosferatu came from. And so it kind of came from like these people who were buried, and so people would freak out if they weren't staked in the actual what is it called? Coffin. If they didn't stake them in the coffin, they were all afraid, like doctors back then, and like people, loved ones and everything, were afraid that they would actually come back and kill them, basically. And so they were always putting like stakes in the heart just to make sure they didn't come alive and come out of their coffin, because one bite would turn you into it. It's not like a blood exchange like Vampire Diaries or anything. At least back then it wasn't. But then it turned into something that's sort of romanticized, which is where Bela Lugosi, I think is how you say his name, comes in. So he was the very first romanticized vampire in the sense of Dracula, and the name Dracula came from Vlad Dracula from Wallachia. So with that being said, it's sort of turned into this romanticized thing, whereas back then it was a monster that would kill you and it would turn you within one bite and stuff like that, and it was ugly and gross. Whereas nowadays vampires look exactly like us.
I have crossed oceans of time to find you.
So yeah, there you have it. But without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so first things first, before we start breaking down the movie, a quick synopsis of the film shows that this movie is as follows. Interview with a Vampire, 1994, follows Louis de Pont-du-Lac, I think that's how you say it, an 18th century aristocrat turned vampire by Lestat, who recounts his centuries-long tragic existence to a skeptical reporter in the present day. So, starting with this first scene, I know it's kind of silly, but it's sort of doing two things right now. Right now, it's setting the scene that this is modern day, for one. So there's your regular film portion of the breakdown, but it's also showing where we are, because I believe this is the bridge in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge. But the traffic in this instance, my mind is telling me, okay, what's the symbolism of traffic in this instance about vampires? And to me, it looks like there's more white than red as far as the car lights. I know this is kind of silly, but just bear with me. To me, my first thought is, what is the balance in each person of the amount of doing good versus bad, or the amount of good versus evil, if you want to go that way? To me, that means that there's more good people in the world than we actually think, and we just don't know it because of the small bad experiences that we've had in the past from people who drain us of things, of our energy, of our time, of our food, of our resources, etc. So to me, this is already saying vampires exist today, but not in the way that we think, in a subtle, subconscious way, if that makes sense. At least for me, that's how I see it. And the yellow lights along the edges of the traffic right there on the bridge, it's like kind of like the guardrails of a bowling alley, if that makes sense. Because a lot of people think there's only the two ways, there's only good and bad, whereas they don't see all the gray that could be outside of the bridge if we just found another way, found another path. So I feel like that applies to a lot of things that people don't think about, or at least have a hard time thinking about, because they're like, okay, well, what's morally right? What's good? What's bad? That kind of thing. I wanted to pull this up because I just wanted to kind of commentate just a little bit on this particular set piece. I don't know if this is actually in the city or not, but I'm assuming it is just because it's a 1994 film. But I wanted to say, if you turn, like if they were to turn just a little bit this way and be on like this side of the street facing this building right here, I think it could be from the Fantastic Four movie in 2005. I think it's the same building. I could be wrong. Okay, so this part where he's talking to the interviewer and says, oh yes, I was gonna kill you, but you don't need to be concerned about that yet, because he was watching him. So what I wanted to say here is that it's pretty interesting how most people who are narcissistic or who prey on those who would gladly give their energy to someone, if we don't have like the discernment to realize that person has that intention, it's very easy for someone like this to target you, for sure. Because I've had my fair share of narcissistic people in my life, which I've covered in previous videos. If you want to check out my breakdowns for what I've been through, you can watch those. They're a little bit different in formatting. They might be a little bit more boring, but I'm still finding the way that I'm breaking things down, so I apologize for that, but they're still very interesting if you have the time. But what I'm saying here is that a lot of the people who are going to drain your energy don't make it very obvious. They watch you. They look at you as if you are easy targets. And you can see that in psychology too, because in psychology, I've read that a lot of narcissistic people tend to prey on those who have low self-esteem or are people pleasers or whatever, something along those lines. So you can see that vampires represent those type of people who kind of drain your energy or target people who they think they can easily get away with, if that makes sense. So with that scene, I feel like it's symbolically showing what it's like to be in the presence of a narcissist or someone who drains your energy, whatever you want to switch that with, whether that's spiritual or psychological, depending on who you are watching my videos. Because I'm not just catering to the spiritual community, I am catering to most people, if that wasn't clear. And one other thing I wanted to say too is that a lot of the times those who want to drain your energy, for lack of a better term, they always are alluring and they are charismatic and they draw you in, much like a vampire. So it's definitely something to be wary of, just because you can usually tell what the intention of that person is based on their words versus their actions. So if you hear them say that they love you and then hit on somebody right in front of you, that's my experience when it comes to people like this in the dating sphere. It could be completely different for other people. You just have to kind of figure that out. It could just be different for different people. So his character here is saying that he just lost his wife and his child from childbirth less than 6 months ago. So I would assume that's like 3 or 4 months ago, maybe less than that, and how he's longing to be released from that. And I just feel that with him wanting to become a vampire to fix that, it's not letting themselves heal from the grief. It's being stuck there. It's being draining of your own energy. You can become a vampire yourself in the sense of draining your own energy by not letting yourself heal from something. And that is sometimes a choice and it's sometimes not. I'm not saying that it's always a choice to be living in pain emotionally. A lot of the times that can be accounted for the free will of others being wielded the wrong way. And sometimes that can cause people to have PTSD or, grief or trauma in some way that doesn't allow them to live in a way that they'd like to, emotionally. And it affects every aspect of their life, just like becoming a vampire does. What I'm trying to say here is that it might be painful to try and heal, but you have to go through it instead of trying to go around it, because going around it or under it or over it, whatever you want to do, only makes it worse, and it only pushes it to the back of your mind for later. And sometimes you don't have time for later. Wouldn't you rather live a life that's full of wonder and happiness after healing through a really rough patch in your life than to ignore it and be in constant emotional pain and have that be inflicted on other people on accident most of the time? I feel like that would be the better option if you can. And there's multiple ways to do that, through stories or through journaling or what have you. You have your plethora of options without having to pay a therapist necessarily, because you can do a lot of the work on your own and work through it, but sometimes you do need that therapist. I'm not saying that you don't ever need a therapist, so I just wanted to make that clear on this section. Okay, so this part is where he has just been attacked by Lestat and is asked basically, do you want to live still? And he says basically yes, and then drops him in the water. And so when he says he left me there, it just reminded me of how narcissists or people who drain your energy tend to just leave you where you're at if you're no longer useful. Or they start, picking on you or whatever, like Lestat did. He saw his opportunity, he drained him of his blood and said, oh, well, you want to live, so let's play around with you. So this is what I was talking about earlier at the beginning with the small synopsis of where vampires came from. So he's just gotten bit, he's just been drained, and now he's sick. So that's usually how it ends up starting anyway, at least in like the old versions of vampire stories, is that you get bit, you get really sick, and then you turn. Kind of like a zombie, kind of like a werewolf, kind of like a vampire, but it's kind of like where all of those came from, if that makes sense. At least that's what I was told. Because vampires did come first, unfortunately, because I am a werewolf fan. But with that being said, I just found this really interesting on this part, because normally with vampire shows today, they don't really show you that. They usually just show like Vampire Diaries style vampirism, where you share the blood and then you just kill them instantly, and then you wait for them to come alive again, which is an interesting way, don't get me wrong, but like it's not necessarily the normal route for vampires. But I will say that this also speaks to how people who drain your energy, if it's bad enough, will actually result in physical ailments sometimes, especially with the fact that, if I remember right, I believe there have been some studies, and if there are some that I can find, I'll link them in the description, but basically a lot of mental stress can affect the body. So when someone is putting a lot of stress on you, either by expectations or emotional stress, causing mental health issues to worsen, stuff like that, it can manifest in physical ailments. So this is also another representation of that. So this part is where Lestat is just basically telling him like, hey, I could give you a new life, and here's all the good parts, but I'm not going to tell you all the bad parts. So basically, this is someone who's playing on someone's sadness or fear or any emotion or feeling that they perceive to be a weakness, a way in. It's definitely something to keep an ear out for, as far as when you're talking to somebody. If they're only telling you the good things, you might want to pay attention to what they're not saying, for sure. It's not just a vampiric thing. It's not something you only see in movies, obviously, because a lot of people use that in sales tactics. They always tell you the good things, right? Which I've tried a sales job. I absolutely suck at it, I will say, because I can't lie. I can't. It's not in me. But with that being said, the important thing here is to remember that if it's too good to be true, it most likely is. This scene right after that, it just makes me think of how he's already set Louis up at this point. He's saying, oh, I'm going to give you the choice I never had. Oh, okay. That's kind of like those who drain your energy, or narcissists in this case, tend to set you up and say, hey, I've been through so much. They get you to pity them and dote on them, and then as soon as you stop or it's not enough anymore, they're gonna demand more. But you'll see later that he does end up actually being like really, really manipulative, despite Louis doing everything that he can to not anger him. But with that being said, this specific scene right here can also be viewed from a bigger picture lens, because it really gives off the energy of the illusion of choice, because Lestat has already set him up from the beginning. He's eyed him, he's followed him, he's attacked him already, and now he's coming back saying like, oh, I have the answer to all your problems, which is basically what these type of people tend to do, much like a politician in my opinion, but I could be wrong. So for this one, when he says, have you said your goodbyes to the light, it just kind of reminded me of when you're in close proximity to someone like this, whether it's romantic or platonic, whatever, a lot of the times it can feel like when you're around them, you're not allowed to shine very brightly. Otherwise they get either jealous or angry, whatever it is, because they want to be the center of attention. They want all of the light for themselves. Granted, this is a vampire, so neither of them can have light. So it shows that when someone doesn't have a light of their own and you start to shine brightly, they try to smother your light to make it easier for them to have control over you, or to make you feel down about yourself, just like they are, that kind of thing. And the reason Lestat turns him anyways, because he wanted a companion, right? Someone to confide in or have the adventures in the darkness with, if you want to put it that way. But this is where I will get a little bit spiritual with it, just because the light versus dark thing, it's like someone just completely giving over to their dark side because the world has been cruel and they let themselves harden their hearts, and so they don't really care anymore. Hence, from earlier in the scene from before, where he says that he can return the feelings to you, he can basically make life better because he doesn't care, he doesn't feel anymore. So with that being said, that's something to keep in mind. And this part right here where he's basically just drained him of all of his blood, leaving him at death's door, and he's basically just telling him like, okay, are you gonna come with me or not, you know? And he won't let him live if he says no. And so again, it's very manipulative, it's very forceful, it's very like insecure. For one, like in a sense, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're insecure in themselves. It's more because it's very obvious that he's not insecure with himself. He's more of just like insecure with relationships. And so it seems like he's chased everyone away, and so he feels like he needs to force someone to be with him, even on a platonic level. And that's sort of how people like that operate, in the sense of like, oh, well, I don't know how everybody has all these people around them, so I have to make people stay. And so it might come from this abandonment wound, or maybe even just a sense of being possessive in relationships. So that's just something that I've noticed. That's something I think about when I'm watching these movies. Again, I'm not any sort of psychologist. This is just my insights that I get from movies. So this part where he says coffins are a necessity, that is one thing that I learned in the vampire class that I took in college. A lot of the vampire myths would say that they would have to bring a coffin with them with the earth from where they were created, essentially, inside, so that they would have part of their own earth to essentially stay alive and sleep on. You can imagine how difficult that would be. I suppose it could be symbolic of just bringing your trauma with you no matter what, kind of like burying it in the back of your mind and not dealing with it at all, just like I mentioned before. But I just wanted to give you that extra little tidbit of knowledge from a history class about vampires. So this just reminds me of when you're in proximity to friends or family or whatever, especially romantic relationships, you tend to emulate those around you. And so this scene where he stops drinking her blood and tells Lestat, he's like, I'm not going to take her life. And so he says, I've already done it for you. It just kind of made me think about how you start to emulate them on a level that you don't even know that you're doing. And so when you're around them enough, you start to take on their beliefs and you start to take on their mannerisms sometimes even. But it's basically just showing you like the line, I've done it for you, is very pointed in my opinion, because when you're around those people, they do it for you. They show you who they are for one. And two, they're influencing you on a subconscious level because of the threat that they pose to you. And your mind can see that. And so it starts to sort of change for that person because you want to be safe, right? So a lot of the times that's what happens when narcissists tend to get you in their clutches, or like people let you drain your energy, whichever one you want to do. Of course, it's not just narcissists that follow or are doing these types of behaviors. And it can be a nature or nurture thing, or both, depending on the upbringing of that person and the experiences they've had in life. But yeah, there's a lot that can go into it that makes a person end up this way. And it's up to them to heal, for one. And a lot of the times they just end up blaming the problems on other people, which again, we'll see later in the movie at some point. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying to be as thorough as possible on this one. So this scene, it just made me think about the historical aspect of the film, since it's shot in New Orleans, Louisiana, and how there was plantations at the time and everything like that. And it just made me think about the history of the US and how the enslaved people probably saw those who owned plantations in this way, that they're very vampiric, narcissistic, people who don't care, stuff like that. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot of things that were wrong back then, but that's just one insight that I've picked up on, at least in this particular scene. Even if the filmmakers weren't trying to portray it that way, a lot of the times symbolism like this can portray more than what they originally intended. So there's that. But basically in this scene, her intuition was probably going off the charts of being like, I should not be here by myself, because of the way she looked around before trying to pick up Luis's plate. Now this is the part where Stephenie Meyer must have gotten her different gifts ideas, because she was heavily inspired by Lestat saying this line where it says, the dark gift is different for all of us. But the idea that negativity and narcissism or draining energy can look different for everyone is what I'm gathering from this. And the fact that Lestat can read thoughts is very telling, because if he can read thoughts, he can definitely manipulate you more than the average vampire, in my opinion. Which just goes to show that his manipulation tactics are like on another level, for sure. Okay, so this part where Lestat is telling Louis like, hey, so evildoers are easier and they taste better. This part just reminded me of like the idea that some people rationalize their behavior by saying, oh, well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so, or I'm not as bad as these types of people, whereas they're actually worse. Not always, but I'm just saying as an example that someone could theoretically be projecting onto somebody else who's actually not as bad, but is still bad in a way, because in this case she is basically someone who had someone kill her husband and then blamed it on a slave. And so essentially she's basically killed two people indirectly, whereas Lestat has probably killed thousands upon thousands of people over the centuries. And so he's trying to tell Louis like, oh, well, we're not as bad as her. One of the lines before that, he says, imagine what they did to him, the slave. But he's basically just trying to explain away the evil that they're doing, essentially. And this was what I was referencing earlier about how people who are draining your energy, or narcissists in general, as soon as you slip up and start showing empathy for something else or start doing something outside of what they want you to do, they start getting upset and calling you weak and all of this other stuff. So not necessarily directly like this in this movie, but is essentially my experience is that as soon as I started, having empathy or trying to put boundaries up for myself, just like Louis here was trying to make sure that he didn't kill the woman and was only trying to get the dogs so that he didn't have his own conscience hurt him, so to speak, because of his actions. Lestat got angry and started telling him he's a coward and you're going to get us both killed, which is true, the second part, but it's not that he's a coward, it's that he's trying to reconcile this new way of life that forces him to take life, and he's never been comfortable with that before, whereas Lestat has had so many centuries of getting used to being that way, and so it's just like breathing air for him, so he gets upset when somebody else can't do it. So with that being said, it's just symbolic of when people don't care, they expect others to do the same. And so when they don't and they get accused of something or are shown a different way, they feel called out and they feel like they're doing something wrong, which is not necessarily the case. It's just life, unfortunately. This is another scene where I wanted to kind of talk about when people who are trying to drain your energy, they basically laugh in your face when you accuse them of it and say, oh, well, that's not me. Or in this case, they do fess up to it. Sometimes that's worse, in my opinion, at least in my experience. Like, you accuse them of something and then they usually say like, oh, well, yeah, duh, that kind of thing, without directly saying it. So in this case, Lestat is amused at Louis's anger about the whole situation about being a vampire, because he said he wanted it, and he basically said to Louis, like, that's why I chose you, because you have this anger inside of you that I wanted to exploit, essentially. Without saying that, he is saying, like, that's why I chose you. I wanted you to act in a way that was unlike you, essentially. It's like the trolls online that say something rage baity and then laugh at you when you take the bait online, except in a much more sinister way, in my opinion, because it's in relation to everyday life, and it's harder to see those types of people in everyday life. They're not making themselves known like they do online. And this is yet another example of people who drain your energy, because right here, this line where he says, life without me would be even more unbearable, is what he's saying in this scene, and basically leaving him to fending for himself with animal blood rather than human. And he says, I'll watch you come around to it. He's basically just trying to tell Louis, like, oh, you'll get used to it, it's fine. But also the fact that he's threatening that life would be even more unbearable without him because of his new lifestyle. And it's similar to how regular people who are trying to use those same tactics will make you think that life would be awful without them. And so it's this weird dichotomy that you're having to reconcile in your mind. At least for me, that's how that experience has been, specifically with an ex-husband of mine in the past. He would say stuff like, I'm gonna kill myself, blah blah blah, that type of stuff, whenever I would threaten to leave. So that's an example for you. So this rooster right here, I'm not going to speak on like the traditions of those who were in plantations and being held as slaves or anything, because I have no knowledge of that. But symbolically, roosters apparently symbolize the spiritual duality of light and darkness, often representing the triumph of renewal and hope over despair and death. And so basically what these people in the scene are trying to do is protect themselves from this evil that is killing off their people and animals. So the rooster that they're using is sort of a symbolic thing in the sense of representing all of that. And especially because it's black and white, it could represent that duality of life and death. And so they're trying to protect lives by using the rooster. So symbolically, in the sense of vampires, they're trying to protect from dying a death that never ends, if that makes sense. And that's just spiritually speaking, in the sense of my own spirituality and how I interpret that based on descriptions that I find online. This scene is where Lestat is pissed off because Louis basically asked, okay, well, you must have learned something from the person that turned you about the meaning of life. And then he gets all pissed off and starts blaming the people outside doing their rituals for protection and saying it's noise and I'm so tired of this. Let's go back to New Orleans or something like that, or France or something like that. I'm so done here, that kind of thing. And this is where Louis says, forgive me for having a lingering respect for life. I don't want to have any part of this anymore, really. And at one point he shows some like vengeful faces at Lestat for the noise outside, because he's like, yes, they know about us, so what are you going to do about it, kind of thing. And at this point, Louis is realizing the predicament that he's put himself in by siding with Lestat. But at the same time, he can't blame himself, but he doesn't know that. He was coerced, essentially, into becoming a partner for Lestat, like I said earlier. But since we're on the outside of the story, all we can see is the bigger picture of what happened. Whereas if you were Louis or Lestat in this case, all you would see is the interaction that's happening now, because you have to kind of zoom out from the inner world of these characters to see the full picture, just like we should be doing in our own lives, like zooming out from the conversations and experiences that we've had and see the meaning of those specific experiences in our lives and try to see what the lesson was from that, or something that we can learn from that. It's not that some things happen that are bad that are always a lesson, but sometimes bad things happen, and all you can really do is try to integrate those things and learn a lesson from it that you can use moving forward, whether that's for yourself or for other people. At least that's what I would do. That's why this channel exists, essentially. So because I want to give people an option to heal themselves in a way that we can have discussions about it and have a really great community of people to talk about things together with. This scene right here is something I relate to on a personal level as well, because with everything that I've been through I lost my spark a long time ago and only recently got my spark back. And that's kind of what happens when we've experienced a lot in life, where it affects who we are and what we like and what we dislike and stuff like that. And so we have to essentially find ourselves again and find that spark and uncover it beneath all of the trauma and anger and wounds that we've accumulated over time through emotions or physical ailments even. At least for me, that's how it was. In the sense of like my physical health problems, my emotional trauma from relationships or from family or anything like that. And it's not like my family was bad. I'm going to put that out there. I'm just saying like certain things that would happen, or, you know, as a trans person, like it would make me feel ostracized in my own family type of thing. So with that being said, it's very universal to feel that you are frightened of yourself, just as Louis is putting it here, because life is draining. And it's only draining though if you allow it to be, and you're living your life for other people, like Louis is for Lestat, or trying to carve out your own little bit of heaven where other people don't like that. Like Lestat doesn't like Louis doing, in the sense of only eating animals. And so unfortunately, it sometimes ends up being that we push people away, sort of like a vampire does, sort of like Louis is doing here. He's trying to find that connection again, but he can't. And so he has to deal with the fact that he lusts for human blood now. So when someone comes in to help you, it can feel like trying to fight your new instincts that you actually don't like, instead of the ones that you used to have before, where you allow that help to come in. Just like this woman is trying to come in and say, you need to send this new person away, they're not good for you, or this plantation, and you know, that type of thing. So hopefully that makes sense. So first thing that I wanted to talk about is the line where he says, you're in love with your mortal nature and you resist the one thing that will bring you peace. So that in itself is just telling him to stop caring. It doesn't matter. These people are beneath you, that kind of thing. And then I did want to talk about the color scheme in the background, which is basically red and gold, kind of like the Lannisters, obviously. Not kind of, but actually like the Lannisters. But spiritually, red symbolizes passion, sacrifice, and life, while gold represents divinity, wealth, and enlightenment. And so in this way, it's sort of a twist of that. It's definitely a twisted version of life, a twisted version of enlightenment. So it's definitely a symbolic thing to think about in the sense of the color scheme in addition to vampirism. So essentially, Lestat is trying to tell Louis, like, hey, you're a god among men. Like, stop caring. It doesn't matter. So it's important to remember that despite status, you are still human at the end of the day, despite the story we're talking about. It's something that can blow up again into the bigger picture, where your actions, especially because of your class, matter. And I'm not saying that poor people don't matter either. What I'm saying is that there's responsibility when it comes to power. And so people in power need to have the responsibility to know that their power affects other people, like the woman that he pulled that blood from. And yet in the next scene where Lestat is saying he enjoys tormenting people, it's giving like, I'm tormented, and so that's the only way I know how to do things now, and I don't know how to change. And so this feigned liking and enjoying this, it's really just a big old cry for help. He's going through hell, and yet he's trying to make the most of it in the most twisted way possible, because he's gone on so long doing it that it's twisted his moral compass into something else. Hence, you know, why being a vampire would probably suck. And honestly, Tom Cruise's face in this scene can really portray that. He's really putting that feeling of, I'm actually tormented. He looks like he's staring off into space as he says it too. So he's got like fantastic acting skills for sure. And the other thing I wanted to add too is like, a lot of times people who are suffering from this energy of draining other people's energy, metaphorically, in life, this is exactly how they feel, I would assume, because it's like they're trying to reach out for connection, but they don't know how to do it correctly. And so it's because they don't have the resources to heal, or that they are refusing to. It just depends on the person. And then I also wanted to touch on the red and green in the background of this particular scene, because it's also got red and green. It has red and gold. So it's really the dichotomy of what Lestat is seeing versus what Louis is seeing and experiencing. So for the red and green, it's symbolizing, again, life, vitality, passion, action, etc. It's also in juxtaposition with the green, which is growth and nature, heart and healing, eternal life, spiritual awareness, that kind of thing, at least according to what I've found online just now. But in the sense of the scene, it's like speaking to the idea of having this complete 180 to experiencing life, or life as an undead person. It's having to go completely against your nature, the green, into something that is more bloody, for lack of a better term. It's a pun, obviously, but he has to go from something healing and enjoyable to something that is full of passion, but in the wrong sense. It's full of life, but in the way of constant living and a never-ending cycle of things. So that never-ending cycle could, like I said, be constant trauma, or pushing it to the back of their mind, or putting it in the coffin like a vampire and sleeping on it. So it's just an interesting thing that filmmakers do by using colors to represent certain feelings and evoke certain thoughts and everything. But it also speaks to the interpretation thereof, or in the spiritual sense, because the symbolism of those colors in the spiritual sense often seems to coincide with graphic design and I mean, obviously it is, color psychology or whatever, but it's just interesting to think about it in another lens of spirituality or self-improvement, that kind of thing. So I figured I'd mention it here. So this line right here that Louis essentially says is, "My God, to think that you're all that I have to learn from." Sometimes our circumstances are the only things that we have to learn from, and unfortunately, not all of them can be good or are good. And unfortunately, we do have to kind of integrate our trauma in a way that can help us move forward in a healthy way. And sometimes that's really difficult. In his case, he was dealing with grief, and so now he's grieving his old life and wishing that he could have lived it and healed from his grief. Because I, for one, had a lot of experiences where I had to ask myself, what was the point of that? Like, why do I have to go through this? Why is so-and-so mean to me? That kind of thing. And with my asking those questions, it allowed me to have an open mind on what those answers could be. And that's something to think about, of course. So this part just makes me think of all of those people who rationalize away what they're doing, because Louis here decided to go towards the plague so that he could find people who might still be alive who were infected with the plague, knowing that he won't ever get sick and that they are going to die anyway. So he wanted to take from a human who is already imminently dying. And so he's trying to rationalize how he can get blood without doing damage like Lestat does. And while noble, he is still taking life. And so with Lestat, he's basically just following him and waiting for him to slip up so that he can laugh at him and be like, see, it's a normal thing. You need to just get used to it. That's how life is. It just reminds me of those people who, especially in political themes, think certain things are just natural, like racism or transphobia, homophobia, stuff like that. Like it's normal and that it's something to just deal with. It's like it's something that can't be changed. And so when he comes in and says, my martyr who'd never take a human life, my philosopher, it's like making fun of people who are visionaries or people who envision a better life for everyone because of their ideals, their beliefs, their core values as a person, and how we have to kind of prove to people like this that it's not always like that. It's not like things can't change. In this scene with the sewers, I personally see this as a crossroads for Louis, because he's sitting here having just tasted the blood of such a young human, a child, and realizing that the peace that he felt in killing was the way forward, but he couldn't reconcile with it in this sense. And it just shows that sometimes the life that we wish we had is no longer good for us. And I'm not saying that killing is good. It's the symbolism behind the innocence that has been killed in him. So with that being said, this sewer and the rats is almost symbolic of him feeling like he doesn't deserve anything better than what he got himself into. And so he's sitting here wondering which path in the sewer to take, the left or the right, or to go out of the sewer. And that just speaks to a lot of people, including myself. I lived like this for the longest time. And no, I'm not a vampire. I'm just saying. I'm just saying that it feels like we don't deserve better when we've been through so much. And that's the only life that we know. And we feel like we're never going to get out of it, you know? And it's something that you have to take charge of yourself. At least that's what I did. I feel like I took charge and really went inside myself and tried to figure out, why am I acting this way? What makes me tick? What do I like? What do I dislike? That kind of thing. What's my passion, you know? And I really had to go deep. I really had to confront traumas that I thought I was over. I really had to go through a lot of trauma from other people that have been caused by other people and reconcile that they're just not good for me in my life anymore, that kind of thing. And just make the changes in my life that I needed, you know, in a outer and inner way, stopping certain habits like smoking and marijuana. Although marijuana I still use sometimes just in the form of edibles just for fun, but it was more excessive to me before. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you need it. But for me, I just didn't want to use it that much anymore. So I switched to every once in a while, and I'm feeling better than ever, honestly. But it doesn't hurt to indulge every once in a while. But in the sense of this lesson that I'm trying to talk about here, it's choosing better for yourself, even if it's something that makes you feel uncomfortable, because in the end, it helps everyone, including yourself. Granted, again, this is symbolic. I'm not talking about actually going out and hurting people. I'm talking about the symbolism behind it. Just want to put that out there just to make sure. This right here is coercion, definitely, because with the almost taking of her life through Louis, Lestat used it as a gift, as he called it, but also is using it against him to say, oh, well, this is your problem now. But also it reminds me of those abusive relationships where one parent uses the children against the other and tells them, oh, well, your mother said this or your father said this, you know, and all of that. And he's saying right here, you see, Louis was going to leave us and blah, 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 you know, just putting it in her head that, oh, well, now you guys are my parents and people die all the time, but putting it in a way that makes her feel comfortable because she doesn't know any better. But it also reminds me of certain aspects of abusive relationships or just relationships in general that say, oh, our relationship is having a problem, so let's have a kid to fix it, and that never fixes it. So that's just yet another thing to keep an eye out for, as far as like something that I seem to see in this scene. When Claudia is playing the piano or anything like that, or whatever she wants to do, she's getting her way all the time. And it's sort of in the sense of two things that I wanted to talk about here. So two things. One thing is that sometimes when we coddle people from a young age, they think that they are entitled to things, and that sometimes can turn into narcissism. And the other way the other thing that I wanted to talk about is that sometimes when people are raised that way, they don't know any other way to do it. And so it's along the same line, but it's not at the same time, because when someone is raised that way and they're exposed to other ways of thinking, a lot of the times they have the choice to continue on their old path, or they can continue and heal because they realize that something they were doing affects other people. And it really depends on how bad, I would assume, how bad the trauma was, or how much it's ingrained, or how much is natural for them to be that way. Of course, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, or a behaviorist. I'm just thinking outside the box of what that could mean. But also, the other thing I wanted to talk about in this particular scene is Lestat's reaction to having a child in their midst. And honestly, like I said earlier, with one of those scenes where he looked like he was kind of looking out into the distance and stuff, he desperately wants to feel normal again. I really do think that, because why would he be doting on this child other than the fact that it keeps Louis around? You know, he wants that family. He really does want that family feeling again, to feel human. But he's doing it in such a way that kind of twists it, obviously, because he's teaching her how to kill and teaching her the ways of vampirism and not realizing the repercussions of it when she finds out about what really went down. But I also wanted to talk about how this is sort of reminiscent of childhood trauma as well, because of the aspect, like I talked about before, where parents use their gripes against the other parent through the children. And so it kind of shows that here with this whole thing that Lestat has done with this child in order to affect Louis. Now, this part, I don't want to get too political, but I thought it was kind of funny how they phrased this line here. Their democratic flavor doesn't suit my palate, is what Lestat is saying. So basically, it just goes to show that when you're a good person with boundaries or someone who has good morals, you're less of a target because you can see it coming from a mile away, is what it's really trying to say, in my opinion. I'm not trying to get political. I'm just trying to say, like, if you have boundaries and you can see that in someone, that they're actually using certain tactics that are meant to persuade you or take advantage of you in certain ways, then yes, you will have a less appealing flavor because it's more difficult to trap them, essentially, if that makes sense. And again, it has nothing to do with politics. It's just more about the boundary aspect of seeing somebody like that coming at you and trying to kill you, in the sense of taking away your spark, is what I'm trying to say. Because people that drain your energy take your spark because they don't have one of their own. They're taking your light and smothering it and trying to take it from you. This scene really gets me a little bit, because she says, why can't I change like everybody else? And that's kind of how I felt for a long time. I felt like I wasn't able to grow up in a way. Like, my body changed, but my mind didn't for a long time, in the sense of, like, why can't I change? Why can't I have what everybody else has? Why can't I be more confident? Why can't I do this or that? You know, stuff like that. And it's almost like a perpetual childlike state that, yes, is a good thing for some things, but it's also kind of a detriment because, like I said, if it's childhood trauma or any sort of trauma that keeps you from growing, it can feel like you're a child again, or still. And so this scene just speaks to the part of ourselves, at least for me, that felt like I was behind, or that I couldn't heal from things, or I couldn't move forward in a healthy way. And so this childlike innocence is gone despite having grown up too fast. At least for me, that was kind of the case. I grew up too fast with certain things that happened in my life, or experiences that I had with both my health and my mental health, such things like that. And it's things that I've integrated and I've come to terms with. And unfortunately, it can be painful to confront those things. Sort of how she's finally confronting the truth that she's never going to change on the outside. The only thing that changes for her is the inside, her mind, her insight, and that she's never going to be like the woman she killed. This one speaks to what happens when you try to get rid of something in your life, whether that's a old habit or a person or a way of living, whatever you want to call it. But it's like when it comes back and rears its ugly head, you have to fight it off with whatever you can. And it also reminds me again about abusive relationships and how sometimes that person can find you again, and how that can sometimes be reminiscent of what I just talked about, of certain habits or certain feelings come back again that you don't want. And it can feel like a vampire in that sense, that it's draining you again, and that you have to fight every urge to go back to it, or to let it back in, I guess is the better term. But this is after Claudia killed Lestat and then put him in the swamp. So he is very upset at this point, which I can understand, because he did want that family. He did want the good things like Louis was trying to, hold on to for the longest time, but in a way that didn't benefit anyone but himself. After escaping Lestat, they move to Paris and they go to all these different places, right? Louis and Claudia. And then they find this guy right here who starts mirroring Louis, or Louis, or whatever you want to call him. I just call him Louis. But basically, this is what I wanted to talk about here, because human to human, we are like mirroring each other, right? And we've always heard projection is something that we see in other people that we hate about ourselves. It's just something that you're projecting outward about yourself that you see in somebody else. Sometimes when we see somebody and we just don't like them for no apparent reason, there's something about them that is completely opposite to your energy, or the same, and it bothers you. Like, for instance, I had somebody at an old job at a fast food joint years back, and I just did not get along with her. She was super sweet, don't get me wrong, but for some reason I just did not like her. I don't know what it was. I just tried to avoid her because I didn't want to be mean or anything or say anything rude. I just didn't like her. Have no idea why till this day, to be honest. The only thing I can really even remotely guess is that she was also getting married at the time to someone like 10 years older than her. So I could see how that, could subconsciously trigger me for some reason. But basically, what I'm trying to say here is that stories are like mirrors of humanity. And when you see someone in real life that mirrors your energy in a way that triggers you, then that's a time to reflect. That's a time to see why you're reacting to that person that way. And it's on a smaller level than stories are, because stories are kind of like how you see another world from the bigger picture. That's why a lot of people say it in horror movies, don't go in there, you know, in a horror movie where they see that this person's about to go into a bad place where the killer is or whatever. But just something to think about, that sometimes when people mirror us, it's supposed to show us something, and it's up to us to think about why that is on our end, because we can't solve everything for everybody else. We have to solve our own inner world so that we can thrive. This part where Armand is talking about how he doesn't see any God or devil, or that he doesn't believe in anything that could damn or save a soul, and that it's just life, is yet again another example of just being indifferent to how things are and not seeing a reason to change. Whereas Louis still sees humanity. He still sees a reason to be kind, a reason to care, even if it's just to see other vampires or to get answers about what it means to be undead or the meaning of life. And I feel like a lot of us wonder the same thing. We all wonder, is there a meaning to life? Is there a God? Is there a devil? Doesn't really matter, does it? Because right now is now, and the only thing we have is each other right now. Because as they say, you know, if God does exist, he's the only one that can judge us, right? And if there is a devil, I'm sure he's happy where he's at. But as far as the devil goes, I don't really believe in him personally, but I don't believe in a regular God either. So for me, spirituality just means the interactions between human to human, and how if we optimize that for everyone rather than just the individual, and how some people's lives are, instead of blaming other people for our problems, we could probably do something really amazing with humanity if we just learn to go within and see that we are all feeling the same feelings and we all go through things. Because vampires could also represent those people who feel alone, that feel like they're the only ones going through something. And so they just resign themselves to life being a certain way, which affects their personality and their way of thinking. And they end up becoming something like this. So it's just food for thought. With Armand saying this line here where he says, but you asked the wrong questions. To me, that just feels like in life we ask ourselves the wrong questions when it comes to what is life about and what religion is the true religion, and stuff like, I don't even know the wrong questions that we ask. But other than the fact that we blame other people, for example, the questions I asked in one of the earlier breakdown portions of this video, where I said, why does so-and-so treat me that way? Or why does this feel terrible to me? Or why do I have health problems? And blah, 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 blah. Those seem like good questions, and they are, but they don't ask the right questions in association with those. So, for example, with the first one about why does so-and-so treat me this way? What we should be asking is why, like a couple of different questions we should be asking. It could be, why am I allowing this person to treat me that way? You have to rephrase it a little bit. And then the other question you could ask yourself is basically asking, and what can I do to change it? Is what you should be asking. Something like that. It can start off that way, where we are just asking questions about life and the interactions we've had and the experiences we've had. And somewhere along that time, it can go from logic to surrender to magic. And magic isn't necessarily the kind that you see in movies. It's the magic of understanding, the magic of knowledge, the magic of seeing yourself in someone else or through a character in a story such as this one. And finally understanding that emotions are just tools at this point. And it's not that I'm completely numb to them, obviously. I'm just saying that they can tell you things. Their emotions can guide you, kind of like a map or like a sonar system of where to go, because you can't see where you're going, right? And where that will lead. So it acts more like a flashlight in the dark of what could be possible. And every time you ask the right questions, that flashlight scope starts to get brighter and wider. And like I've explained in a previous video, the prism vision that I've referenced before, it's like finding each puzzle piece, those hexagonal shapes, and clicking them both together and then adding more pieces and finding those answers and connecting them all in these random ways that don't seem connected, but they are or can be. This part right here is pretty ironic because he talks about how the world changes and they don't, and therein lies the irony that finally kills us is the line. So with that being said, change eventually happens no matter what, whether it's in the good way or the bad way, and all the ways in between those for any of us and all of us at the same time. And so eventually the world will change, just like it's changing now with all of the regimes around the world being toppled by the people. That's just one example. Whereas the world no longer tolerates the darker sides of humanity anymore, including tyranny and narcissism and not caring about other people, having to worry about a roof over your head type of thing. That's why so many people are looking for universal health care and basically asking for the basics of life, which is a place to live, things to eat, and a place to sleep. That's it. At least the basics for now. And that's why a lot of places like Nepal have had their youth stand up, because they realize there's nothing good for me if nothing changes, you know? And it will eventually kill us if we don't change. And change is inevitable for everyone, like I said. And if you don't change, life is all the more harder. So my recommendation is to change. If not for yourself, then for other people at first. And then let it change into changing for yourself. Because that's how I felt in the beginning. I lived my life for other people and I changed for other people. And eventually I grew tired of that. I told myself, why am I changing for all of these people and I'm still not happy? I'm going to change for myself, even if it makes other people upset. And for me, that meant coming out as trans. And it also meant finding new people to hang out with. And that also meant leaving church and finding my own spiritual path. And that's what I always recommend too, is to find a path that fits you. And again, I'm not a psychologist or a doctor or anything, so I would talk with them first if you're feeling like you need a life change. But that's what I did. And I want people to realize that movies can be tools as well, at least for a time, before you probably need to start talking to somebody about your issues, especially if it's lifelong and something that is really pulling on your energy. This part where Armand is telling him that he needs Louis to usher in the next stage of vampirism because the change that's happening in the world is too fast, and so they are seeing their way of life crumble before their eyes, like I said in the previous part of this breakdown of this part. And what I find fascinating is the lines that he says here. Says that he was the fall of the century because he can reflect emotions still. He can still feel. Whereas a lot of other vampires can't after a certain time in their life. And Armand wants that in his life because he knows that it means survival. He knows that change means survival. And so that's why he wants to leave these other vampires he's in charge of. And the fact that people still feel and care today as human beings is a sign that we are seeing the broken heart of the world, as he says in this scene. We're seeing the atrocities, we're seeing the abomination of anger and hatred and what that can do to people if we don't change. It's realizing that we have the power to change through our emotions. Intrinsically, on a subconscious level, we all realize that. There's a reason why generations like mine and even the ones after mine have been trying to correct generational curses, such as being the one to end the cycle of abuse, for example, and healing from that and cutting off those who would perpetuate it in their family, in their friends, whoever, you know, and it can affect the bigger picture of things, of course, if we don't change. It's essentially saying to the earth that I see your pain and I'm going to help you fix it because I care about you on the divine level of seeing things. At least that's how I'm interpreting it on the spiritual level. Armand in this scene is admitting that he needs someone to save them and that he sees that he is it. He sees that Louis is the one to do that. Mostly because he's so young, but also because of his feelings and how he can still feel for things and people. Like I said, I would argue that Armand is more dangerous than Lestat, because in this scene he acknowledges, yes, that I knew that you were going to do all of this. And then Louis makes a good point where he says that all of those other vampires trusted Armand, and he let them all die. And Armand says something about, the first lesson is that we must be powerful, beautiful, and without regret, which everybody wants that, right? And to me, it's just yet another manipulation by a stronger vampire, because he sees Louis as 10 times the vampire than the others could, because he still feels. But because he still feels, he'll have more potential than the other vampires ever did, because as soon as he gets him to realize that being a vampire is just taking life and not to care anymore, he'll be more ruthless than any of them. That's what I'm seeing here. He just wants to have one vampire that could be just as bad as 12, or however many there was, because he sees this as a challenge. And remember, he's a manipulator. Vampires in this talking point, like I've been saying, are manipulators, people who are narcissistic, who are drainers of energy, hence drinking blood. So we have to remember that he is not here to help him. He only sees him as an opportunity to corrupt. He only sees him as an opportunity to really mess with his emotions, because he has feeling. But in this instance, instead of trusting Armand in the beginning like he did, he now sees the boundaries that he needs to make. Louis, I mean. And so this is why he's been asking him directly, because he knows that Armand is going to tell the truth to a point. And so he's deducing what he should do with Armand before it gets too bad. And quite honestly, that reflects real life too, because when you see those boundaries, like I said before, it's easier to like nip it, cut it off before it starts growing and making it harder to get away from. And this is what I'm talking about. He already called him out. He says something along the lines of, but you knew. You knew exactly what was going to happen, and you regret nothing because you feel nothing. And then he says, and you want me to quicken you once more, basically. He wants him to make him feel something again by taking away what he feels. And he would rather feel those feelings than get rid of them, because it guides him, just like we need to do with our feelings, instead of ignoring them. Because if it doesn't guide you, you don't see a reason for life. And so you lose your boundaries, you lose your morals, you lose so much more than you would if you keep your feelings and feel them all the way through. This part right here really speaks to me too, because this is what it feels like for me to watch movies, because it speaks to my soul on some level, or on many levels depending on the story. And that's what it can feel like when we watch movies, and it stirs something in us depending on what we see, what we feel, and what it reminds us of. And with those things, you can always choose to do something with them, or just make them something that you've thought of during the movie and just push it aside, whereas it might be trying to tell you something, which is why this channel is here. I think that just like the end of A Knight's Tale, like I said in the Knight's Tale breakdown, at the very end, Chaucer says, something like, I don't remember exactly what it said. I'll put it right here if I can look it up. But the quote was something about all of human experience can be captured in art, essentially. And that is very true. I don't know if anybody really took the time to understand exactly what that means, because that means that everything that humans have experienced thus far is and can be shown in film or art in general. And it might not look like this, but it could also look like a abstract artwork, or a sculpture that somebody made that looks really weird, and we just haven't interpreted it that way ourselves, and so it might look strange. And unless we have an explanation from the artist, we just don't have that insight that they do. And so I feel like we treat art in its forms like different textbooks on things that someone has learned, or something that we could all learn and integrate into our own lives, so that we can all move on as a society. And that's why I feel like art in general is political. A lot of it is political, if not all of it. And I feel like there's a lot of people that would agree with that sentiment. So movies allow me to see the wonder of life, of the human condition, of different ways that we can respond to things, and that there's this one thing in common with every one of them, and that is to always choose the better path if you can, if there's no other influence in front of you. And even then, there's always a choice in what we do, in what we say, in what we partake in, and what we don't. And it might not feel like that in the moment, but when you look back, that's when you wish you made the better choice, whatever that might have been. But unfortunately, it has passed at that point, and so all you can do is learn from it and watch it back like a movie and see where you went wrong so that you can correct it for the future, because change is inevitable, like I said, and we just have to learn to live with it, just like Louis. Right here is the example of what happens when someone realizes that they have no power over you anymore, and how they might actually fear you even though they might not actually say it. And it's really only an issue with you. Now, if they were to go find somebody else like Lestat does at the end of the movie, different story. They found somebody else that they could torment. But it is always good to treat them with kindness, but with boundaries, because you're giving them that chance to see that, hey, you could have this life too, but you need to change, you know? It's not that they're bad people necessarily. They do make bad choices, but it's not that they're not human. It's just that they're dealing with life in a completely different point of view, and we don't understand it. And we need to offer them kindness, but with boundaries, so that they know that that's not okay. And if we can, we need to show them, hey, this is what we need to do to help you. Or offer therapy as an option. And I know a lot of them will say no. But if you keep putting up enough boundaries, a lot of the times they will eventually, at least I'd like to think they will eventually cave to the idea of therapy. But if they don't, then that's on them. They're not changing, and so their life is not going to change. They have to be willing to change their life. They have to be willing to change the way that they view the world and themselves. That's all they can really do. So as soon as Louis is done sharing his story with the interviewer, he's so angry because he's mad about the ending of what Louis was talking about. And you can see the anger in Louis's eyes, and he says, "You haven't been listening." And then the interviewer says, "Yes, I have. People would love this. People would die. People would kill to have this type of life, blah, blah, blah." And all Louis says is he closes his eyes and he's like, looks away. And then he says, "Give the story to others. Learn what you can." He's saying, learn to change, learn to feel and be okay with that, you know, because not changing is detrimental to your health, both mentally and physically. You don't have to be a vampire to suffer from not changing. And I feel like that's super important, and because a lot of people are super emotionally detached right now because of how the world is. And unfortunately, systems do profit off of that. That's how they gain power. But by feeling and feeling all the way through and having people to confide in through community helps put the power back for the people, for one, at the bigger scale of things, on a political scale. But on the individual scale, it helps heal that inner part of you to feel what you're feeling. Within reason, of course. And I'm not a therapist or anything. I'm just putting these things together based on what I've experienced in my life. And I can tell you that from not changing and only changing to things that other people expect you to be is awful. And like Louis explained, it feels empty. It really does, because at the end of the day, you're not allowed to be yourself. You're not allowed to explore. You're not allowed to change who you are unless someone else says so. And that's no way to live. So really take what this story says and take it to heart. Read between the lines. Break it down for what you think it means for you. Because what I'm saying, this is just my experience and how I'm interpreting it. This is my point of view. It might be different for other people, and I want to hear what that is for you. And hell, I'd even read tons of essays from other people if I wanted to, understand other people's point of view about these things. I think it's fascinating. Human nature is fascinating to me. And unfortunately, I don't have the money to go to get a degree in psychology. So, and nor do I want to be honest, because, I do, but I don't, because that's not my passion. My passion is movies. But on the offside of that seems to coincide with it, although it might be helpful in a career aspect, is to learn about psychology fully and better embody characters in the future, if I decide to do that, as far as acting and stuff, which it is on the bucket list. I'd like to have at least one role in my life to say I acted in something, but that is the dream, is to be in film. And I know it's not all glitz and glam. I'm just saying it'd be a really fun experience. But besides the point, I hope you get what I'm saying here. So the song at the end of the movie is called "Sympathy for the Devil" by the Rolling Stones. And it was covered by Guns N' Roses in the movie. But apparently it's just a song about exposing the violence that humanity is capable of. But it also shows the duality of man, and just as much good can be done by humanity, just like I've been saying. If we realize our potential as humans, that we have control over our emotions more than we think we do if we use the things around us to help teach ourselves how to heal. And it's different for everyone. Again, I am not saying that I have the answers to everything, and nor am I a doctor or anything of the sort. I'm just saying how I've done it, and that's through movies and music. So with this movie, I feel the overall message is not just about vampires at the surface level. It's also talking about how life is really what you make it, and it's better to actually make it a life worth living than not. Because if we don't, and we focus on all the bad things going on around us or in our own lives, it's just going to make it worse for yourself. And we need to learn how to deal with change on big and small levels. Otherwise, if we don't, we metaphorically die ourselves. And if it's done on a mass scale, like it's happening now with all these authoritarian governments and everything, it will lead to the ruin of the human race. I'm just saying. Because if you think about it, if it's normalized that all of this violence is happening, and it happens more and more and more, and it becomes normalized, all of that, then who's to say what's going to happen in the next 20 years? I'm not here to scare you, by the way. I'm just saying, like, put 1 + 1 = 2. You know, like, why not try that the opposite direction? Why not reframe everything as, well, what if something good happens to humanity? What would that look like? And start embodying that, you know? It makes you think. It's more than just a movie, guys. Because that's why I love movies so much, because there's these underlying messages at the core of everything of these movies. We just haven't seen it yet. We haven't had anybody talk about it like this yet. And I wanted to be one of the first people to do that, at least the ones that I know of. I haven't seen it myself. So if there's other people that talk about movies like this, let me know, because I want to see it. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And let me know what you think about the movie in the comments, as usual. Let me know what you think the movie's about, or what you think helped you in the movie, based on either what I said or what you introduced in the movie yourself by watching it through, or whatever you want to say in the comments, as long as it's good and nice. So, or maybe even like constructive criticism. I'm okay with that too. Or having a discussion about certain viewpoints. That is okay, as long as it's done with a good intent. But with that being said, as always, keep your mind and your heart open. Peace.